Внимание! Говорит и показывает Москва. Слушайте и смотрите Красную площадь. Парад Победы!
Государственный флаг Российской Федерации и знамя Победы! Смирно! Для встречи слева! Накра!
Военнослужащие почетного караула вносят на Красную площадь государственный флаг.
Hello and welcome to the Telegraph for this presentation of the Victory Day Parade live from Moscow. I'm Dominic Nichols, the Associate Editor for Defence here at the Telegraph, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alyona Hlivko, former Ukrainian MP and now, possibly briefly, although she never answers me when I talk about future political ambition, for now a consultant with Atticus, a strategic consultancy. Alyona, thanks for coming. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you. Good morning.
So the parade is just about to get underway. You've got a live feed here from Moscow. This is held every year in Moscow to remember the victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. I'll be focusing primarily on the military side of things. I'll look to Alyona for translation and Kremlinology, the dark arts of reading the Kremlin's who's hot and who's not list through body language, who's standing and sitting where and so on. But first, a few words about what today is not about. This parade has nothing to do with honouring the memories of the fallen from the war. Putin would want you to believe that, but the reality is quite different. As evidence of that, ask why he has cancelled the March of the Immortal Regiment. We will explain what that is and analyse why that is so significant later, but it is a controversial decision, even in Russia, and proof that he cares not a jot for the generation that fought in the war. We all remember them, but he will not. In his 23 years in power, and it has been 23 years, even when he stepped back to be Prime Minister and let Dmitry Medvedev play at being president, it was clear to everyone who was calling the shots. So in his 23 years in power, he has framed the Victory Day Parade as the embodiment of his rule and of Russia's identity. He has sought to position himself as the legitimate heir to, indeed, the personification of the spirit of that wartime generation. And he wants Russian society to believe that he, and only he, can keep the barbarians away from the gates, that he alone is strong enough to stand up to the West, led by an evil and scheming United States. And where there are no enemies, he will invent them. NATO, Ukraine, you name it. They're all degenerate Nazis, and only he is strong enough to defeat them. So today is all about power. Putin sees the Victory Day Parade as the manifestation of his power. Now, some people have said to me that the Telegraph shouldn't be showing this, as all we are doing is amplifying this idea of Putin's power. And I couldn't agree more. Look, you may not like the Telegraph's politics and some of the output from this broad church of opinion, but we are British. We believe in fair play, of sticking by your mates and standing up to bullies. So as we are now 15 months into Russia's 2-week lightning attack, and Moscow has gone from saying, we'll be in Kyiv in 3 days, to saying, don't worry lads, Putin wasn't killed in the drone attack on the Kremlin last night. If Putin wants us to talk about power, how powerful or otherwise he is, and how amazing or otherwise his broken and morally bankrupt army is, I say, pull up a chaise longue, Vladimir. You're about to be reminded quite why you are so afraid of a free and open press. So, Alyona, how important is this day for Russian society? Good morning.
Good morning, Dom. Indeed, this day has become quite important for them, but not for the reason that they would actually be able to name now. Having grown up in, well, I call it few very brief years of Soviet Union, and then having grown up in Ukraine in early 90s, and then all the way throughout the 90s, you kind of grew up with that feeling that was kind of pushed towards you that, you know, this is basically the greatest day in our history. Forget about Independence Days, forget about anything else that's happening. This is the day that proves while we're a unique and exceptional nation, why we all stem from this great Soviet Union. And in the 90s, that was still the case for all republics who came out of Soviet Union, all the states. So that's just part of their identity, really.
I think it's fascinating that this is happening today, just a couple of days after we had the coronation of King Charles III here in Britain. I mean, it is an absolute contrast. I mean, on the one hand, Putin will brook no opposition, no chat, no dissent at all to his rule, and I mean that is not the case here. There was some controversy over the weekend about the arrest of the anti-monarchists, and the Met Police seem to have managed to get themselves in a right old pickle over that again. But actually, it's right that causes such a stir, because what we are seeing here with this Victory Day parade is just about power, as I said earlier. And I thought the coronation was much more about humanity. We literally saw the king stripped down to his linen shirt and kneeling in front of us. He was very vulnerable and humble.
You know, I think that's quite a good point to see that contrast between the two worlds, really, that are not that far apart. Geographically, but you could see the dictatorship, and you were saying earlier that I'm going to tell you who's who and who's wearing what. But realistically, that's what you could expect at the coronation. You know, all the heirs to the throne and the monarchy family members who've managed to escape, and that's just, you know, the fun gossip and part of the culture of this nation. But you can definitely see the benefit from democracy, even though it's a constitutional monarchy. The state has rules, and the biggest problem is that Harry went off to live in the United States. Whereas there, if you say something wrong, you don't stand in the right line, you dare to speak up or not agree with the policy line, you're dead the next day.
So what we're looking at the moment, this is General Sergei Shoigu. He's Russia's defense minister. He's clearly taking the salute to start the parade. What do we know about Shoigu? His popularity has waxed and waned a bit.
It's surprising that, I must say, it's surprising he's still there, given all the failures that the Russian army has had. But I think that also plays to an image of exactly what you were saying earlier. They need to have this parade. They need to have the Minister of Defense, who's been there for over 6 months. When was he replaced by the previous month? Even longer than that, actually. They need to showcase the continuity and success, the perceived success that they're trying to portray here.
But of course, it was only last Wednesday when the Kremlin was hit by 2 mysterious drones. We've still no idea if it was, well, who it was. You know, I mean, Russia said it was America and Ukraine, and they've denied it, and who knows. But I mean, last week there was also a car bomb that targeted an ultra-nationalist writer in Russia. That's the third since the start of the full-scale invasion in February 2022. There have, in the last couple of weeks, been freight train blasts, fuel depot fires. What do we know about the internal opposition to Putin's rule?
Well, first of all, we can see that with killing off yet another far-right activist, they're trying to shut down the dissent within their own people. Even if it's the dissent that's oriented against Ukraine, they still don't want multiple voices getting out there and criticizing the regime that has failed to win a successful war on Ukraine. We've obviously seen, as we've discussed many times on the podcast, the dissent that's within the country, various sabotage acts. Some of them Ukraine did take responsibility for, the Ukrainian special forces, some of them not. There's definitely a variety of opinions within Russia. The voices are not that strong, but all the blowing up of rail lines and all the warehouses, we've seen what's been happening in Crimea lately, that all shows. Things are not as in line in Russia as we'd like to see. And this parade, in fact, Dom, it does only prove to me that Kremlin drone attack was completely staged and fake. Because if it was anywhere close to being real, and if Ukrainian drone or NATO drone, as they claim, got that close to the Kremlin, this would not be happening today.
Well, I mean, they did close down. Red Square has been shut off to the public for 2 weeks. Drones have been banned by the mayor of Moscow after last Wednesday's attack. And we hear there's always interference in the GPS signal around Moscow, but we hear that's absolutely gone off the clocks in the last week. With you try and order a taxi on a kind of ride-hailing app, and it shows that the taxis are in the river, I'm told. So this is much heightened security this year. We're expecting it to be shorter than last year, partly because there's so little kit left. It's all either in Ukraine or in pieces in Ukraine.
Yep.
And also, I mentioned earlier on, we're told there's not going to be the March of the Immortal Regiment. Can you tell us what that is and why that's significant?
That is quite a significant event because that's when all the relatives of everyone who's died in the Second World War carry their portraits and commemorate their lives and their sacrifice. We normally had it, as I was saying, in the early 90s, even early 2000s in Ukraine, every single year, and that showcases the level of sacrifice, which is this year. I don't think Putin really wants to draw attention to the victims and the fallen soldiers, because there are so many of them in Russia now. The numbers are just staggering, that he doesn't want to have any risk of one mother of a soldier stepping outside a line and starting some sort of provocation during this very carefully staged, orchestrated show.
He often takes part in that march. He carries a photograph along with the relatives, because he does, of course, he tries to use this parade. He sees it as his direct succession of the army that defeated Nazi Germany, and he has to show strength and control. Victory Day Parade is one of the moments where his whereabouts are known in advance, so it's a huge security operation. There were comments about would he no-show? Is it actually a body double who's standing there instead of Putin? But the March of the Immortal Regiment is that line, is that the last remaining family members, direct family members from the Second World War. So to cancel it is very significant, because if this parade is all about that, honouring those people, to cancel that, because, as you say, he doesn't want anybody to think, oh, hang on, well, what about the thousands dead in Ukraine, is very significant.
Yeah, because imagine that you can kind of sift through the people that would be there in Moscow, but all the other cities and towns across Russia, they just didn't want to bring that up.
So that's Shoigu now handing over to Putin. What does he say to him there? Oh, in fact, I'll go quiet, because if you wouldn't mind doing your best to translate what he says.
So
let's hear how fantastic he thinks the day's going.
Favorite moment in time. What a majestic music.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи солдаты и матросы, сержанты и старшины.
So he's now addressing citizens of Russia, naming all the military people who were there, the veterans of Second World War, which is strange, and then the veterans and participants of the special military operation in Ukraine.
С праздником в честь наших отцов, дедов и прадедов.
The celebration is dedicated to people who've immortalized the heroic nature of Russian nation and obviously saved everyone from Nazis. Oh, there we go. Didn't take long to move towards the Nazis of modern days. And, of course, it is Russia who's the victim of the world waging war against it.
Нет недружественных, враждебных народов ни на Западе, ни на Востоке.
Well, that's quite an interesting line. I suppose that's something that he would use. He just said that there are no unfriendly nations for Russia, be it in the West or in the East, whereas I think there's even a special law designating unfriendly nations, and the UK has made that honorary list as well, I think last year. But obviously it's all the fault of the global elites who are aimed at dividing societies and provoking the bloody conflicts and coups, obviously referring to Ukraine revolution in 2014. And there we go, didn't take long for him to mention the rotten West with its gosh, I don't even know how to translate it. The values that go in the very wrong direction, sacrificing the status of family, classic marriage, traditional marriage, and that's basically the main reason for why the West has gone mad and is waging the war in Ukraine. The typical homophobic narrative the Kremlin doesn't fail to repeat, even at the Victory Day parade. Touching upon decommunization in Ukraine, taking down the monuments of Soviet war heroes, as they call them, so generals and everyone who was part of the Red Army, probably meaning all the writers and poets, because Ukraine has been decommunizing and now taking down even Pushkin statues across Ukraine. So it's very interesting. Oh, he just mentioned that the goal of the global elites, as he puts it, they've just collected and kind of gathered all the Nazis from across the world in Ukraine to make Russia fall apart, obviously, stop developing as a nation. And it's all the Western ambition, again, coming from rotten values.
What, like a Nazi Davos?
Yeah, there you go. That's all in Ukraine. Did the UK send their Nazis to Ukraine as well? Like a regiment of Nazis? Kind of where he's going with it. So basically, the whole narrative's going towards the same thing. Just as they started saying shortly before this, and I think that the Kremlin drone strike was a pretext to that, that it's not just against the war against Ukraine, it's the war against NATO, or NATO waging a war on Russia. United States, United Kingdom, and other states are the countries that he's mentioned. Interestingly enough, he's also mentioned that China sacrificed a lot in fighting imperialist Japan in the East. So that's a notch towards his desired ally. Multipolar world, the narrative we've heard before at the latest UN Security Council, I believe.
Очень важно, что сегодня здесь, в Москве, собрались лидеры стран Содружества независимых государств.
So he's saying that the leaders from CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, are all gathered in Moscow today, which we could see. There is the president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev. We just saw the leader of Turkmenistan, Turkmenbashi. We saw Kyrgyzstan president, there's Lukashenko, illegitimate president of Belarus, and on his right-hand side was the Prime Minister of Armenia. So those are basically what the four nations he could get there. Realistically, no one else. Uzbekistan president as well is there. And here's the moment of silence for all the fallen soldiers who've got mothers, sisters, and families left in Russia. It is a great shame that he's trying to speculate on that very dramatic and tragic moment in history, especially considering all the lives that Russians are taking in Ukraine today, the lives of both Ukrainians and Russians.
And by number, most of the Soviet citizens who were killed in the war came from Belarus and Ukraine.
Yep, Ukrainians lost 8 million lives in that war, and that was the main argument we tried to deliver to Germany, that look, you don't want to provide weapons, not to have them on the Russian soil, but what about Ukraine? Can you help us protect ourselves if you feel that indebted? Oh, there's the main propagandist, Solovyov. We just caught a glimpse of him. And I was saying to Dom earlier that it's interesting how they have these veterans in between the leaders of the states, and realistically, have they actually participated in the war? Because the real veterans who actually took part in military actions should have been over 100 years old now, if not more. Talking about commemorating those fallen people and their values and how they now need to upkeep those values. Very, as you can see, very value-based speech, obviously trying to relate to anything. Now talking about the special military operation, veterans and participants, as that is the most important area of work these days, because that's the security and the future of statehood in Russia depends on those fighters. Clearly just turning everything around again, that it's NATO attacking Russia, and you know they need to defend themselves. Classic mobilizing tool. That's quite fun, actually. The whole of the country, all of Russia, is now mobilized to help those militants on the front line. People are trying to help as much as they can, praying for you, so the whole country is behind you. Clearly not something that we've been seeing with all the sabotages going on.
Is that the only time he's used the word mobilized?
Yeah, I believe so, that the whole country is there for the frontline fighters.
Because there is this idea that he might try for a full mobilization, but it's hugely controversial. So maybe this is a soft introduction to that.
Yeah, so far it's been very soft, mainly just highlighting, you know, the importance of their fight to upkeep the statehood of Russia and how important it is, trying to give it that sense of, you know, having the higher ground and heroic nature of that. Just naming all the military units that are currently fighting in Ukraine. This is so twisted. I mean, I was used to seeing these parades growing up, as I've said, every year. And in that time when you're growing up, you don't really know what actually happened, who fought which war. You kind of believe it. But now, talking about that there is nothing more important than love for your home country to victory for your country. Hip, hip, hooray. There you go. So, I don't think we've heard anything that significant. Very soft touch, as you rightly said. No announcement of further mobilization, of further dedication to making that victory come along. No further actions, really. And what's really interesting, no loud mentions of any great victories in Ukraine either. It's basically a very kind of self-defensive act, this speech of saying, okay, we're being attacked, we're under threat, but, you know, I don't know, gay people from the
Degenerates.
West, essentially.
Degenerates in the West.
Yeah,
People
degenerates.
who might have a glass of wine at lunchtime.
Gays and Nazis, because every nation has sent their own Nazis to Ukraine to fight the glorious Russia. Oh, there's Lavrov. So that's quite a weak speech. That would be my summary of it.
And did he give any agency whatsoever to Ukraine, or is Ukraine the hapless victim of the degenerate West, and you're just having this thing done to you by NATO and the US and the UK and everyone else?
So that was quite a careful balance. He didn't give Ukraine any agency whatsoever, but he also didn't try to make a victim out of it. It's Ukraine was influenced and probably brainwashed, and then became home to all the Nazis from across the world. And it's interesting that he's mentioned two states in the West, the United States and the United Kingdom. So you guys are clearly playing the strongest role in helping Ukraine defend itself. No other EU nations, none of that. And then an interesting careful notch towards China and fighting imperialist Japan, who, again, Japan is also helping Ukraine quite significantly in this war.
So does that, I mean, would he be singling out the chief baddies here? Does he see the US and the UK as the linchpins holding the external support for Ukraine together?
It seems like it. I think he does realize that where probably all the support stems from. Those are the two nations who kind of corroborate NATO's support for Ukraine, that are the core of NATO. Maybe I think that's also an address towards the internal audience, which inevitably it is. But I think the goal there was to kind of name the two countries that are deemed as aggressors against Russia and still leave France and Germany out of it, just because, you know, Russians will still want to go holiday on the southern coast of France, and Germany was always a bit stronger ally than everyone else in Europe. So that was quite interesting that he left everyone out of it.
And obviously name-checked China, because he's desperate for a much closer relationship with China. He needs political top cover in the UN Security Council. He needs weapons, he needs oil. So yes, unsurprising that he name-checked China. I mean, when I did this last year, pretty certain China didn't get such top billing. I don't remember a mention.
I don't think it did. I don't think it did indeed. And I think he really put in a lot of effort to get those leaders of CSTO nations, some of them, to Moscow, because I think last year there was no show either. I think it was one or two leaders at most.
So if we may just talk briefly about the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, what Putin would like to think, like to style as his equivalent of NATO. How big is it? Who are they? Where do they come from? And what does it mean to have that together?
So he tried to get all of the post-Soviet states into that organization. It's a very new collective of states, military base, as you rightly said. That's an aspiring NATO of Eurasia, I suppose. Maybe that's the right way to call it. So we have Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia there. The Armenian Prime Minister is the chairman of CSTO, obviously Russia. There are some countries that refuse to participate strongly in CSTO or don't donate as much as Putin would like them to, or don't participate in the so-called peacekeeping campaigns. One of those peacekeeping campaigns are in Karabakh in Azerbaijan. So there is that issue between Armenia and Azerbaijan. That's why Azerbaijan is not really part of that community. And it's really just Russia bullying all the nations that are dependent on Russia economically into contributing military-wise and, most importantly, their people to go fight their wars wherever they're needed. Because I think even yesterday I read on the news in Russia that Russia is actively trying to recruit labor workers in Central Asia. So they're promising them a shortcut to Russian citizenship just to come work to Russia. And obviously we know that as soon as you come over to work and you get your citizenship, you're mobilized, you're off to the front line. Yeah. So he's still trying, being as imperialist as it comes, to recruit people from Central Asia to go fight their war.
This was migrant workers from other nations who are working in Russia were offered 1 year as opposed to 5 years fast track to citizenship, plus a sign-on bounty and a generous monthly wage for the months that he's still alive, type of thing. Because he's desperate not to mobilise. He can't. Even he feels that he could not take Russian society with him to go for full mobilisation, because he'd then have to say it's not a special military operation, it's a war. And so he's got to find personnel by any means he can. We've seen the Wagner group, the mercenary group, emptying prisons with deals that serve for 6 months in Ukraine and then have your convictions quashed. And we believe some have, the few that have survived 6 months. But they're desperate to get manpower from wherever they can. I've heard anything from 2 weeks up to a month of training, which is nothing.
That's
and
ridiculous.
then shove forward.
Yeah. And I just find it despicable that the presidents of those states can sit there peacefully, completely subjugated to Putin, and just kind of face their people being called into Russia and then sent off and killed off on the front line, rather than ethnic Russians. How do you allow yourself to be subjugated? How are you leaders to free nations and independent states?
How much of a choice do they have?
Well, look, they're still independent states. Yes, they're heavily reliant on Russian economy. Kazakh gas is flowing through Russia mostly. You have all sorts of other ties and trade, imports and exports, and obviously labor. Sure, you even get loads of influx of Russian money and investments into your countries. But Ukraine was in the same position once, because obviously that was the Russian goal. There comes a time when you need to actually become independent, sovereign state and stand up for your people. It does come with a price. We're paying it now, and yet we are ready to pay that price.
Now, Kazakhstan has played an interesting diplomatic game in the last year. In January 2022, President Tokayev needed to call in the CSTO brackets. It was Russian troops, probably 98%, to put down popular uprising in Kazakhstan. So we thought that he was absolutely beholden then to Putin, but he's tried to carve out a little bit of diplomatic distance since then. He's here today, clearly. You'll point him out again when we see him shortly, but he has tried to carve out a little bit of diplomatic room for manoeuvre, has he not? Or am I being too generous to him?
I think he has, and that's why I'm a bit surprised seeing him here today, but maybe that is, his nudge towards Russia and trying to balance.
He's just there on the left of the screen, isn't he?
Far left, yes. He managed to get out of last year's protests quite successfully in the country, and he even asked that, so-called CSTO fighters out of his country as soon as the situation was stabilized. He's engaging with the West quite actively and not skipping any dialogues with Secretary Blinken to cleverly, the UK Secretary of State visited Kazakhstan just ahead of their elections in April. They are trying to advance their democracy as well by, for example, limiting presidential term to only one 7-year period. So this could essentially be the last presidential term for Tokayev, and he actually implemented those changes. So I think they're making their steps forward. And last time I spoke to some friends from Kazakhstan from the diplomatic service, they were saying that about 64 major global companies have now moved from Russia into Kazakhstan because they have a very good legislative environment for businesses to move. Whoever's leaving Russia, they're either leaving and going back home to the West, or they're going to Kazakhstan. So I think that's quite a promising country in Central Asia to pay strong attention to and try to make them our friends rather than Russia's. Obviously, there's also China, who is a strong ally and partner to Kazakhstan.
Now, can I just ask, I wonder if I'm confusing myself here. There seem to be many more people on parade here smiling, not these sort of granite-faced gentlemen here, but a lot of people seem to be smiling, and I've never seen that before from Russian, or have I just not been looking closely? I wonder if they've all been told, show you having a good time, lads.
Indeed, and I haven't actually seen these straight lines before, because normally it's all a bit hectic and you could see that it's forced and really a bit disheveled, whereas I think they've tried hard. I'm sure they've been asked or forced into smiling, put on a brave face. NATO is attacking us, but look how great we are, we're going to prevail. All the same tactics for putting on a good show.
Well, I mean, if you're going to have a drill parade, then you do need your straight lines. I've got a certain sympathy there. I seem to remember drill is a pill which should be taken twice a day. Thank you, Colour Sergeant Brian Crilly of the Irish Guards. Well, good morning. You are joining Dominic Nichols, Associate Editor for Defence here at the Telegraph, with Alyona Halivko. We are live presenting the Victory Day Parade from Moscow. These are live pictures from Red Square in Moscow. Putin's already given his speech. It was notable for three reasons, really. Firstly, he name-checked the United States and the United Kingdom as the chief sort of architects of his opposition, sort of drawing together this band of international Nazis to send into Ukraine to fight Russia. He also name-checked China. Of course, China he needs to have a warm relationship with for political top cover, money, oil and weapons. But also it was quite notable how very quickly he morphed into trying to draw parallels with the Second World War into the war in Ukraine, and about how this is all indicative of the world and the West being against Russia. So not a huge number of surprises so far, maybe a few little bits and pieces we've drawn out, but what will be interesting to see is quite how long this lasts for and how much military equipment we see on parade, because not a lot of it is left, a lot of it is in Ukraine, a lot of it is in pieces in Ukraine. And some of the things, such as the T-14 Armata tank, is now a little bit of a laughing stock, as in it's a wonderful prototype, but it's not in mass production. So we will see in a moment, after the troops have finished marching past, quite what we get there. But thanks for sticking with us. We'll be here for a little while longer, till the parade finishes, trying to draw out the lessons, and I will look to Alyona to pull out the all the Kremlinology, who's sitting next to who and what does that mean and so on. But thanks for joining us.
As you were rightly saying, Dom, it's surprising that they have quite a lot of officers marching. Normally, this would have been over by now, just based on my extensive experience of watching this parade growing up every year. They would move straight towards some heavy artillery quite quickly. Obviously, even I think there were thermobaric weapons at some point in this parade. I think they're all deployed in Ukraine now, sadly.
And do you think these would be conscripts or contracted service personnel? I mean, they, as you say, the drill is looking pretty good. The lines are straight, so it suggests that they have not only just shoved a uniform on for the first time, but a lot of the contracted servicemen will be in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not quite sure. So this is, for example, the national police, Russian national police forces. So obviously they're just employed and they're contracted. As you rightly say, they started with students of various military colleges and establishments. So that's what could be the reason why they're also quite well prepared. Again, this is a military academy, so they're just the alumni of the academy. So we don't quite know whether these guys have any military experience just yet. Okay, this is the National Guard.
Now, notably, President Zelensky moved Ukraine's Victory Day parade to May the 8th. So 1945, the armistice or the surrender was signed on May the 8th, which, because of the time difference, was May the 9th in Russia, and that's why it's marked today. But the German surrender actually happened on May the 8th. So President Zelensky has announced that that will be Victory Day parade in Ukraine from now on. But today, May the 9th, he's going to underscore Ukraine's ambition to join sort of the Western club. He's receiving European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen in Kyiv today, and Brussels marks May the 9th as Europe Day, honouring a 1950 French declaration that then led to the founding of the body, which then became the EU. So President Zelensky, I mean, okay, Russia, they've called him a traitor for moving the Victory Day parade by a day. I mean, it's just laughable. It's all shaping the information narrative. I mean, never mind that it's still going to mark the sacrifice of those that died in the war and suffered years afterwards. He's a traitor for moving the date. But, you know, a very pointed message there from President Zelensky about which way he wants the country to go.
Absolutely, and that transition has been happening for many years now in Ukraine, actually. So I think after the second revolution of dignity in Ukraine, we've moved away from celebrating just the 9th of May. And mind you, and to give an idea to the Western audience, again, having grown up in post-Soviet Ukraine, it wasn't until I was in the later years, oh, we have the artillery coming out, there you go.
Now it's always led, that's a T-34 tank, which basically was the battle winner in the Second World War. So it's always, the parade's always led by a T-34, Second World War vintage T-34 tank.
Well, it's nicely polished, at the very least.
Well, it's had a lot of attention.
Okay, here we go. We're starting with the artillery. And just to quickly finish while it's all coming out, we've moved from celebrating just the Victory Day on the 9th of May. We then established the 8th of May, and until I was in school and started learning world history, I didn't actually know that the war ended on the 8th of May. We had no idea. It's, you know, the great 9th of May day. That's when we won the war. No other knowledge. Plus, the war was not 1939-45. It was 1941-45. So, you know, the Great Patriotic War. That's all we knew before we actually started learning history. Oh, what are those?
Well, these are new armoured vehicles that they are used in the war in Ukraine. Figures this week from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs says that they've so far, if we're calling them armoured personnel vehicles, Russia's lost 7,216 of those so far since the launch of the full-scale invasion.
So I'd be interested to hear from you, Dom, how much do you think artillery will have been here compared to maybe other years, or is it enough for military parade, or are we actually going to see shortage of those?
Well, Russia loves its artillery. Stalin said artillery was the god of war. Their doctrine, so the way of doing warfare, is very artillery-led. They smash a place up and then send troops in afterwards to stick a flag on the rubble. That's basically, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but not that much, to be perfectly honest. That's kind of what they do. So they love their artillery. They are very, 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 or they were very, very, very well equipped with artillery. Since last February, they've lost 2,962 artillery systems in Ukraine and 547 multiple launch rocket systems. Now, these look like RS-24 Yars nuclear missile launchers. Yeah, so these big 8x8 wheeled trucks carrying one nuclear missile each there on the left of the screen.
Well, of course there couldn't be.
The missile is not,
been a parade
it would go on the top. It's not there. These are armoured personnel carriers. That looks like a BTR-80, I think. Rone transporter. Mm-hmm. Is that right? Am I saying that right?
Yeah, Rone transporter. Well done.
Right, now these fellas, I've seen these before. These are more self-propelled guns. Well, they're leaping around. Slow down, boys.
It's all about the picture.
So there we go. So these are S-400 Triumph. Yeah, the S-400 Triumph, known in NATO as the SA-21 Growler, long-range air defence missiles. The vehicles that had the 4 huge missile tubes on the back. That's a Yars-24 with the nuclear missile on top. I mean, yeah, it might have one in there. 8x8. You can tell that by, well, you can tell it by the nuclear missile on top, but it's got very prominent 8 wheels.
Could not have possibly done a parade without the nuclear threat towards the West, right? The usual narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Russian military has shown itself to be a pretty hollow shell surrounded by what we think is reasonably capable strategic rocket forces, nuclear forces. Now, a lot of the quantity, the capacity of the rest of the Russian military has shown itself to be a bit hollow, largely hollowed out by corruption through the logistics system. But you know, you don't take that risk with nuclear diplomacy. So look at that, that's why he's smiling, because it's the nuclear weapons that are keeping him in this game. Those were the S-400s just going off the screen there, the Triumph SA-21 Growler in NATO terminology.
They didn't move towards the nuclear weapon quite quickly.
Well, they talk about nuclear weapon use much more so than we do in the West. For us, it is really, it's just such a horrific concept.
Yeah.
That you don't want any ambiguity at all. So it's better to have no communication unless you are actually engaged in nuclear diplomacy, because of the opportunities for miscommunication and escalation. Mm-hmm. So we don't really talk about when we'd use it or we threaten it. These guys take a very different view. You've got Dmitry Medvedev, who I said briefly became president in the early 2000s when Putin had to step back for constitutional reasons, although it mattered not a jot. He's now the deputy leader of Russia's National Security Council. He's forever threatening nuclear Armageddon. I mean, last week after the drone strike on the Kremlin, on the dome of the Kremlin, which we've seen a few times, we'll point it out again when it's next in shot. But Medvedev was calling for, I don't know, liquidation of the West and nuclear this and God knows what that, and we're going to steal all your garden tools and never give them back. And he really went tonto. But they do refer to it an awful lot more than we do.
Well, so I suppose that was that for the artillery. What do you think? Was that sufficient enough, substantive? It seemed quite short.
I mean, no. They've got many more systems than we saw. We didn't see any. We didn't see any Pantsir SA-22 Greyhound in NATO terminology, the short-range air defence. Probably because they're all committed. There was not much. I mean, we haven't seen any tanks yet. I'm sure we will in a moment, but we've not seen any tanks. That can't be it.
Is that an actor that we just saw?
I don't know. It might be Steven Seagal, isn't he? Isn't he in Russia? Isn't he sort of?
Well, definitely greatest fan of Russia. So I think they're saying that the parade is over.
Well, it's odd that they're now marching again. There's no more vehicles. I mean,
they're leaving the Red Square. Yeah.
We haven't, other than the T-34, which was a museum piece, we haven't seen any tanks. Although they have lost 3,707 tanks since February last year. I think that's it.
They're all in the fields of Ukraine. Yeah.
We didn't see any. We haven't had a fly past. No helicopters. Mm-hmm. They've lost 294 of those. No air defence systems, lost 304. No aircraft. I thought we'd at least see some of the Su-25 Frogfoots, maybe. Nope. But they've lost 308 aircraft, fixed wing.
Well, they're all in Ukraine.
I mean, that is very. We thought it might be shorter this year, but that is very surprising.
I think that's the briefest 9th of May parade that I've ever seen. Normally, it's dragged out for so long that you just can't bear it anymore. It goes on up to 3 hours.
Wow. Nobody needs that. You're watching live feed of the Victory Day Parade in Moscow. Thank you for joining us here at the Telegraph. I'm Dominic Nichols, the Associate Editor for Defence, joined by Alyona Hlivko, former Ukrainian MP. Maybe future, I don't know, she won't say. So we think the parade has finished. Absolutely startling that it was so small. We saw one T-34 tank, as is always led by the T-34, which won the Battle of Kursk for Russia and kept them in the war, basically. It was an amazing tank, cheap, mass-produced, but very good. So that was always seen. And then after that, we saw a couple of artillery systems and some armoured personnel carriers. And that was it. No tanks. I mean, Russia loves its tanks. I even made my book up. Thank you to the International Institute of Strategic Studies. I tabbed all this up with all the vehicles and they didn't turn up.
There you go, they're all history now.
Well, they might all be in, having engaged in the turret throwing competition in Ukraine. So I think we're coming to the end now. Putin is, he's saying goodbye. He now moves around the back of the Kremlin and lights the, or marks something at the tomb of the Immortal Warrior. Is that correct? Or tomb of the, is it Immortal Warrior?
Immortal Warrior, yes.
Immortal Warrior. So we'll see that shortly. But I'm very surprised. I thought it was going to be pared down this year, scaled back. But
not to this extent.
No, that's extraordinary. Okay, so let's do a bit more Kremlinology here. So none of the other national leaders have, well, they're not in shot. They've not gone to join him.
Yeah,
he didn't go down. I didn't see him go and say cheerio.
I think he just said goodbye to everyone, then did a round of greeting the veterans, even though I was saying to you, I'm not sure those are actually real veterans, because we've seen some come by our school growing up in the 90s, and they were in the late 90s, the people who actually participated in action. So those may be veterans who were teenagers or children when the war started.
78 years, so if you were...
Okay, what is this?
I mean, you're going to be
little square
into your early 90s. We've not seen Gerasimov yet. General Valery Gerasimov, who's the head, he's the head of Russia's armed forces, and he's also, a few months ago, given responsibility for the war as well. So, you know, he's got a day job, which is running the whole of Russia's armed forces, and then in his spare time, he's got to run the war, because Surovkin before him and the other commanders just weren't doing it. So we've not seen him today. That's interesting. I would have thought this very obviously close association with the military, we'd see the head of the armed forces get a few handshakes from Putin.
That's what I was about to say. We've seen some of the CSTO leaders, we've seen some veterans, we've seen Minister Shoigu, and that's about it. No one else really from his, close circle, as they put it. No Patrushev or Surovikin, or no Secret Service, FSB. No one from all those people we saw at the National Security Council last year before the full-scale invasion, when they were all kind of signing up to this war. There's none of them here. Clearly indicates towards not a very friendly and happy atmosphere within those circles, and probably not 100% agreement and alignment, let alone Prigozhin. I mean, that would have been fun if he was somewhere around.
So Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's known as Putin's chef, he's from St. Petersburg. He got to know Putin when Putin was mayor of St. Petersburg. Prigozhin had a number of restaurants, and he then gained some lucrative catering contracts for the Kremlin, so he became known as Putin's chef. He was the financier, and he's now the leader of the Wagner mercenary group. He's had a very public falling out. Over the last few months, he's been in and out. He sets himself up as the opposition figure to the establishment in the Kremlin. But in the last few days, he came out very strongly criticising the Russian military for not supplying him with ammunition. Now here he seems to be meeting some of the leaders from the CSTO. Can you say what's going on here?
They're back. Not quite sure what exactly they're planning to do, probably aligning their logistics. Maybe they will go and lay down wreaths or flowers to the monument that you just mentioned, to the tomb of the fallen soldier. I suppose they're still needed for entourage.
He's not shown any great love to Lukashenko.
No, not at all.
Leader of Belarus? Well, the illegitimate leader of Belarus.
Lukashenko for him is probably like that part of the marriage that's falling apart, but you still kind of count on him to, take care of your kids, and still need to provide for that long estranged wife that's heavily dependent on you financially. That's probably the relationship between Russia and Belarus now. And I think it's not a secret that he's greatly aggrieved by Lukashenko and really irritated, because so far Lukashenko has managed to get everything he could out of Russia and still do very little in some concrete, tangible steps to supporting Russia in this war. I mean, none of the Belarus soldiers, there is no front line in Belarus, obviously, and none of them are fighting on Russia's side, or very few, and it's single occasions rather than a concerted effort.
Lukashenko has allowed Russian troops to train in Belarus, and allowed Russian fighter jets to launch from the country. But yes, he's not yet committed any of his, I think, 15,000 troops in the Belarusian army. That seems a bit low. Can't remember why I've got that figure. Let me have a quick peek.
I'm not quite sure about the numbers, but the army, as in any post-Soviet army, it's not that strong. Everything has really fallen apart in the last, I don't know, 10 years. Especially in Belarus, there was no strong sentiment to fight for anything. They felt quite protected. Well, really from anyone, even though no one really posed a threat to Belarus in last years. It was mainly to protect the regime. So I think that kind of sufficed for him in the short term.
Right, here we go. Belarus, the army. Yeah, 11,700 according to the International Institute for Strategic Studies.
There you go.
11,700 in the army. 11,300 in the Air Force and air defences. 6,000 in the Special Operations Command. Yeah, so quite a small army, Belarus.
So if we add that up, that would be up to 13,000 at most.
I have to take my shoes off, but yeah, not far off.
So just to put that into perspective for the viewers, imagine that in Ukraine right now we have 700,000 active, I don't know what you call them, troops, not necessarily troops, so it's everyone from army to Air Force, Special Forces, border guards, etc. 700,000 mobilized, involved in this war.
And we met Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, who's the legitimate ruler, or she won the election in 2020?
2020, yeah.
But it was then, I mean, widely recognised. This is not clearly the degenerate Telegraph spin. It's widely recognised that she did win, and the polls were then rigged. There was huge social unrest, and it did look for a moment as if there could be an overthrow of Lukashenko's regime. It didn't happen. Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, her husband was in politics. He's in jail now. She had to flee. She's now in, I think, Lithuania.
I think so.
She
yes.
came through. The Telegraph met her a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago. You'll find the interview online. Very impressive woman, and she's rallying support for a future democratic outbreak in Belarus.
That election in 2020 in Belarus just shows us such a good example of how you simply cannot abandon the states in the former imperialists, or maybe Russia is a current imperialist, you can't even call them former, vicinity, who desperately try to break through and get out of that dependency. And you know, the West, I don't want to blame the West for everything, but most nations that could have supported that effort slightly more and helped them really push that over the line and help them get the win in the elections and protect the results, and actually not even overthrow Lukashenko, but just put the legitimate, legally elected president in place. That's why we have the situation we're having now with Belarus and them being involved in this war and helping them launch missiles and jets towards Ukraine, because the country was lost, unfortunately, to democracy. We've seen the same in Moldova. That's why we now really need to help and support and protect President Sandu of Moldova, because she is Western-leaning rather than the former president of Moldova, who was one of the former Russian oligarchs as well. It's very important to support those nations who desperately try to approach the West and implement the Western values, rule of law, democracy in the countries, and not to abandon them, because then they fall directly into the dictator's arms, and it just makes his coalition stronger.
So here we are. We're now on the west side of the Kremlin, I think. Tomb of the Immortal Warrior. The fire never goes out. You saw it at the back there. There you go, on the bottom of the screen. That flame never goes out.
Yeah, the eternal flame.
The eternal flame.
Gosh, that's so Soviet. I mean, just seeing these sceneries is just fascinating. How far Ukraine has gone away from this reality.
I was there with British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace 10 days before the launch of the full-scale invasion. He went over with the Chief of the Defence Staff from Britain and a few other senior military leaders in one final last-ditch attempt to stop the war, and it didn't work. but he said at the time he had to try. Now, I think what happens here is they're going to lay wreaths, and then Putin will be invited. He will have to go forward. He will shuffle a couple of leaves around because clearly they don't get it in the right place, and the principal visitor has to make it look right. I mean, that's a bit of theatre. Ben Wallace was asked to do the same thing. Bashar al-Assad from Syria visited last week, and he also was invited to attend the wreath laying, and he made a bit of a mess of it because he wasn't sure what he had to do, and he tried to wrestle it out of the hands of the soldiers who were putting it in place. So it was a bit of a diplomatic moment. Might not be invited back.
Oh gosh.
Let's see this bit of theatre. I mean, look how far away Lukashenko on the left of the screen there. He's what, 1, 2, 3, 4 people away from Putin. Arguably the closest leader in terms of military support. Well, he is the closest leader in terms of military support to Russia, and he's not right next to Putin. Am I just making this up? Have I been brought up on too much Smiley's people? Is that significant?
I think you're completely right. That is significant, given we've seen the long tables and the access to the body, as they call it in our countries. Whoever's closest is the most important, really. So we can see the strongest friendship stemming from this is what Turkmenbashi, the leader of Turkmenistan, and on Putin's right-hand side, if I'm not mistaken, that is the president of Kyrgyzstan. I can't really see from here too much, but Kazakhstan is making sure that he stands at least one person away. And as you can see, it's very symbolic that Lukashenko, president of Belarus, and Pashinyan, the chairman of Collective Security Treaty Organization, who's meant to lead this pro-Russian war effort, is on the very...
He's the far left with the beard.
Yes, at the very end.
Okay.
Yeah. And that just speaks towards the fact that Pashinyan was speaking out against Russia and Putin because he didn't feel like Russia was supporting him enough in Karabakh, in the war with Azerbaijan, saying that, well, since Russia's not helping us, we're not helping Russia. So we could kind of see that there's a change of dynamics there.
Is he the president of Armenia?
Prime Minister.
Prime Minister of Armenia, who welcomed Nancy Pelosi a few months ago, controversially. And when she visited Armenia, there were EU flags and Ukrainian flags flown as she was visiting.
And that's kind of saying to Putin, look, if you're not supporting me, I always have some other ways to pivot, which obviously is nothing but a show, but also, I mean, shows some kind of bravery in playing their game and trying to get the most out of Putin, being as pragmatic as it gets. Okay, there we go. Well, that was quick. So they've served their purpose, the CSTO leaders. Again, kind of symbolic that, it's a military alliance around Russia that's there to celebrate their tremendous victory over Nazis.
So the one person we've not seen, well, you very briefly saw in the crowd, Lavrov, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Indeed.
Now, maybe not necessarily expected to play a major role at this event, but he had a much bigger role last year. Again, am I reading too much into it? Is it telling that he's not been front and centre? Or rather, is it the CSTO here were not this prominent last year?
I think they're definitely making an emphasis on, unity around Russia, because Russia does realize that it's isolated in the world. Everyone's united for Ukraine, so he needs to create some sort of visual of alliance. Now, when it comes to Lavrov, indeed, we've only seen him once in the crowd, and he was shown alongside, so we've seen other individuals for that very brief moment in time in the crowd, which was Peskov, Putin's spokesperson,
Peskov,
and we saw Solovyev, who's the main propagandist on Russia State TV. So he's kind of now falling in line with those, half bureaucrat, not so important figures that are just doing their job. Maybe Putin also blames Lavrov for some failures on the international stage. We saw the terrible reception at the UN lately. I mean, Lavrov was first denied visa, and then people just started brutally to his face saying everything they think of Russia chairing the UN Security Council, and he's not managed to create that wider international support for Russia, apart from CSTO leaders. I mean, Putin is mentioning China, not the other way around. There's no side of anyone else. We've talked on Telegraph podcast many times about them trying to even corroborate support within the global south, countries in Africa. We've seen, I think, some military generals amongst the crowd that we also got one shot of from Africa, and that's about it. So yeah, maybe that indicates towards failures of Russian foreign policy.
Yeah, I wonder if this is Putin saying, I tell you what, I'll do it myself. I'll get the leaders in. We'll all go and lay roses at the tomb. If you can't do the sort of diplomatic thing, I'll do it. So as we look at Putin, he's flanked by the leaders of, as you say, Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan, do you think?
Yes. Interesting that he keeps choosing those two to be next to him every single time they have to stand somewhere. Probably the ones that have thrown the least amount of tantrums at Putin, really. And it's really a shame for Kyrgyzstan, especially, because they were once the leader in democratic transformation in Central Asia. And maybe internally things are still going well for Kyrgyzstan, but sadly, internationally, they're turning the other way around.
So just briefly, what do you think of this suggestion that he has a number of body doubles, that he's not actually him?
I'm starting to believe General Kirill Budanov, who's the head of military intelligence in Ukraine, because he says it so convincingly and reassuringly every time during his every single interview that there's at least 5 even like hinting at the fact that maybe Putin is dead altogether. Now, I understand that when you listen to a public interview delivered by the main spy in the country, you can't really take everything for face value. You need to know that even his interview is an operation in itself. You know, the misleading, oh, there you go. That's an important moment of, I guess, a mother of a fallen soldier, which looks like a recently fallen soldier in Ukraine.
She wasn't that old.
Yeah.
And the photo was not very old.
And he doesn't look like, you know, a veteran from the Second World War. Yeah, it looks like a young man in the photo, or professional.
Lukashenko, Belarus.
Saying goodbye to all the leaders. I think he's trying to depart earlier than everyone else. That's an interesting development. Yes, definitely saying goodbye to everyone. And looks like he's the weakest amongst them all, just with his body language. Okay, well, nothing seems to have come out from that interaction, but we couldn't really expect much. It seemed like he was willing to engage. It also seemed as if a woman just came out of nowhere and approached him directly. That photograph, and he tried to calm her down, say that, you know, probably your husband, brother, son, whoever is fought the righteous war against Nazis, so thank you very much for that. You'll get your, I don't know, what is it they're giving away to mothers these days, a fur coat in due course.
Yeah, we've seen everything from a car to a set of towels at one point.
Oh, there you go. Isn't the worth of human life worth 3 towels in Russia? That's the point in history we've come to. Absolutely despicable.
So we should just note, I mean, you mentioned China earlier on, but doesn't seem to be any diplomatic presence there. We would know, I'm sure he would have made a point of it. Excuse me, but Chinese Foreign Minister Xinjiang is due to visit Europe this week. Beijing announced that on Monday, yesterday. And Mr. Xing is going to hold meetings with counterparts from Germany, France and Norway all week. I mean, China are trying to, they see themselves as they see this as an opportunity to further their diplomatic heft in the world. Is that fair? And they see themselves as part of the solution, a deal maker, peace broker. Do you think they genuinely think that, or they're just trying to, if not curry favour with Russia, then they're just in it for the long term?
It definitely seems to me as if China is seizing the moment to reinforce its position in the global world as an important actor that the West needs to speak to, because there came a time when, you know, everyone started talking about Huawei and data intelligence gathering and interference, spying on corporations and countries, etc. And China was really addressed as the #1 threat in the world. And I think that almost made China believe in their might even more than they probably believed at the very beginning. And now with the Russian war on Ukraine, we can see that China has recognized an opportunity very quickly that it can become even more than Turkey, this moderator between Russia and the rest of the world, absorb some of Russia's wealth, maybe even territories, who knows. We've seen signs of those, even in China, with, you know, some maps of Eastern Russia being now called Chinese names. Yeah. You've covered that on the podcast as well. So I think China will definitely try to make itself even stronger now because of this war. It's important to talk to China, of course, but we also need to be very cautious and aware of that, and, you know, have very strict red lines almost, by not allowing anyone, any of the authoritarian states, to grasp too much, because Russia will inevitably fail. It's important not to grow another authoritarian aggressor out of this war.
Yeah, I think James Cleverly, Britain's Foreign Secretary, made that point last week, that you have to engage with China, but understand the the dragon pit you're stepping into. So you've been watching the live feed from the Moscow Victory Day parade. I'm Dominic Nichols, Associate Editor for Defence here at the Telegraph, joined by Alyona Halivko. It looks like we're about to wrap up. We don't control the feed from Russia, that comes to us from an external service, so I feel we're about to wrap up. President Putin has left. The Collective Security Treaty Organisation leaders have also gone. So I think we're about to come to an end. Alyona, what were your reflections from this parade? What do you think we should draw out of it?
So I think several points. Number one, very weak international stance, which was kind of supported by those leaders of CSTO members who were there, who were probably forced there just to create some sort of perception of Russia not being on its own in the war. So that indicates towards exactly the opposite, that Russia is on its own in this war. We didn't even have a representative from China. I'm not saying that she would have been there or should have been there, but there was no one there. Second, it was very short. We've seen loads of students of military academies and colleges and whatnot. We didn't actually see the real fighters, contractors, maybe very few. We saw, I'm sure you can address that, very few artillery pieces. Obviously, the main attraction of that was the nuclear weapon that they kind of dragged out to, you know, again, scare the world and showcased towards that. And then second, he didn't mention any victories in the Ukraine war thus far, and he didn't even draw out any plans or, you know, we're going to do this in the next few months, which they normally like to drag about, you know, capture Kyiv in 3 days, take the rest of the south back, whatever. He didn't draw out any plans, which just indicates towards their uncertainty. I think they're feeling kind of lost, and they're almost already trying to make excuses for those losses by blaming NATO waging war on Russia. That is a narrative that seemed to be quite interesting. It's nothing new, but he's reiterated that. It's not about Russia fighting Ukraine, it's about NATO fighting Russia.
Interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to get another fix of Telegraph news and analysis on the war in Ukraine, I should suggest you join us at 1300 London time on our Twitter space, Ukraine the Latest, which is then polished, takes out all my ums and ahs, and comes out as a podcast a few hours later. But thank you so much for joining us. Alyona, thank you as ever for supplying your insight and the translation, live translation. All I can say is send me another ping, Vasily. I think that's about it in Russian. But thank you for joining us. And from the Telegraph in London, good morning.